Hi folks, with Tassus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a spate of documentaries that I've seen recently, and along with some docu-dramas. So that's like a dramatization of an alleged series of historical events. Now, these documentaries have all been produced by usually subcontracted out to NGOs that are globalist controlled and have a very deep-seated and intense hatred of everything that's white, straight white males, white society, white achievements, white history, white everything. They hate everything about white people, and the people that are doing these documentaries, in the main at least, are white people or people that have been living in white societies for generations. So this intense hysterical hatred is in itself a strange pathology, suggesting that they're mentally unbalanced, these people, or maybe they're just paid very well to produce ridiculous and hysterical propaganda. Who knows? But just looking at these, the pattern that they follow is all the same. I mean, for example, just looking at how facts are disregarded, how nuance is disregarded, context, perspective, the whole thing. Now, here's one where there was an area of the world around the Caribbean and Central America where there were a lot of slaves that were acquired from Africa and brought to the Caribbean and to what today is South America. So there's no mention that these slaves were purchased from African slavers or Arab slavers. There's no mention of that. The inference is that white people went rampaging across the length and breadth of Africa, just randomly grabbing black people and sticking them on ships and all that thing. That's completely not true. That's an absolute and utter lie. Now, just all I had to do was say, and these slaves were bought from black African slavers or Arab slavers, then that would have been the perspective, and they need to make that clear, but they didn't. The inference is that it was white people doing it. Now, the other is they're particularly focusing on the British. The British are really the target they're going after here, because the modern world has been, as much as anything, developed and built by the British, so that's the target that the globalists want to denigrate in particular, and undermine and destroy white society, white history, and present it as being all bad, or particularly what the globalists like to do is present it as illegitimate. It's illegitimate. The new way is the legitimate way. That way is illegitimate, and justifiably, as the globalist propaganda says, needs to be denounced. So, but they can only do that by telling lies. If it's that bad, they don't have to tell the lies. They don't have to make things up. So the fact that these documentaries, the clear situation, these documentaries present a horribly distorted view, including many, many, many lies, then we know that the globalist story is crap and is unsaleable. They have to tell the lies, and they have to force feed it down the mouths of vulnerable children or just simple-minded people. Not everyone has a perspective or a grounding in history. I'm a mad history buff, and in fact won the high school prize for history, if you don't mind. But I'm a history buff, so I can look at that and just see that the flow of reasoning and the flow of logic in the argument doesn't fit. I mean, even without knowing the details, I can see, hold on a minute, that doesn't fit. But most people can't do that, and so a lot of people accept these utter lies as being some sort of depiction of a reality. So in this particular area of the world, the British were sixth they came sixth in the importation of slaves into the region. So the British were quite low in the overall scheme of things. But that's not mentioned. Again, here's a key fact. If you want to go after the British and make them look bad, fine, do that. But rely on facts. Don't pretend that all the slavery in the region was British. It wasn't. The British were actually quite low down. Out of, I think, seven groups of people were importing slaves into that region, and the British were sixth in that. So, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and so on, the French were much higher up the chain in during that time. So that's one. So there's two misrepresentations, chronic in my view, that it was the black people that were selling the slaves to the whites, black chieftains and regional potentates and despots and so on. So that was the first. The second one is that the British were quite low down the scale. Also, the failure to mention that because the Europeans were coming across land that had no agriculture on it or next to none, that they were able to look at these areas and say, wow, look at all this land here. We can plant crops here. We can do this and so on. And that land was unused. The natives weren't using it, certainly nowhere near the scale that the Europeans would use it. So the Europeans were putting it to far more productive advantage than the natives were. Now, this should be mentioned. Now, as unpleasant as it may be to, equity fanatics, the idea is that people with superior technology and superior understanding and organisation can come along and make better use of resources. That should be, as in more productive use, that should be something that's mentioned. But it would be a pat on the back for capitalism, and so they don't want to do that because that would concede ground that they want to hold from a moral perspective. So again, well, let's omit these facts. Let's not state these facts or mention them because it may make our argument less potent or less formidable. So let's leave that bit out. And this is a method of reasoning you see throughout the whole thing. If they come up to anything that's key in the historical perspective of things that makes their argument look bad, they'll just simply omit it. They won't mention it, and will focus and amplify and overstate the shortcomings. Now, it goes on, in the slavery thing. For example, the Europeans were the first to develop long open ocean going ship sailing technology. The Europeans were the first to do that. The Portuguese in the initial stage, at least, the Portuguese being real pioneers in that technology, and then it being improved upon and furthered by others, such as the French, the British, Dutch, and so on. But this idea that the only people that possessed that technology were Europeans should be, on one hand, a celebration of European technology, but instead it's woven in the other way that everyone had this technology, but only Europeans used it for bad reasons, enslaving people and so on. Now, the other mention, coming back to Africa, was that this idea of capturing slaves to do the work and the major works, particularly things like public works and that sort of stuff, was the go-to thing in Africa. That's how it was done by black tribes and Arabs and everybody. That's how it was done. So the Europeans came along to a very well-established, long-term established system of black slavery in securing a workforce. And that's so they already came upon that situation. It already existed well before many thousands of years before white people turned up. That's not mentioned either in this in these series of documentaries. So as we come back to now to the slavery itself, why were black slaves in particular selected for the Americas and the Caribbean? Well, they did try white people first, then they tried the natives. The natives were very susceptible to European diseases and were not into labor-intensive work other than again in enslavement conditions. So they weren't any good for the work. White people died and succumbed to diseases. So the only workers anywhere in the world that were available that did not succumb to the diseases, or white people's diseases for that matter, and the swamp diseases from the air, and who were capable of the heavy work were the black workers. So by a series of defaults and no other options, black people ended up. So this idea that it was white people purposefully selecting blacks to be enslaved, and that it was very much a racial thing, is nonsense, absolute nonsense. But there's no attempt at any sort of nuance in that. It's straight white people, evil fascist Nazis, black people, poor oppressed victims deserving compensation. It's presented in that absurdly simplistic perspective that simply isn't true. Now, the growth of the empire, say the British Empire, which was remarkable, that some little island with 7 or 8 million people, less than 10 million people, could build this worldwide empire is in itself sort of quite incredible. But just through superior technology, superior organisation, better social cohesion, all that sort of thing, that's what allowed the British to. So it's a huge achievement by any stretch, by any method of measure. It is a huge achievement, and one that should be celebrated. But instead, it's being today, the globalists are providing vast resources to anyone prepared to denigrate it and tell the most terrible lies about it. So this is an important sort of thing to keep in mind, that almost none of what you see in these docudramas and documentaries is real. For example, there was another one where some idiot who didn't know shit about history was sent around Africa, around Sierra Leone and down that west coast area, including, by the way, looking at cities like Freetown and so on. Now, that was largely set up by the British so that freed slaves could go there and be returned to Africa from Caribbean or the Americas or wherever, and be free. Also, they could, for example, run away from their African slavers in Africa, because the blacks enslaved each other in vast numbers. So they could run away from and go to this place that would be protected by the British as a free city for former black slaves, or anyone who wanted to go, actually, but former black slaves. Now, that's not mentioned, and yet it's absolutely key. I mean, that's an absolutely central point to mention. But instead, the reverse, it's presented as a slave city that was made, and slaves were forced, and it was evil white people again. So no mention that whole area around Freetown was set up purely for black people. The other thing another thing which is seminal point, which is not mentioned, is the fact that at the end of the Civil War, the Americans, and even before that, the American government and indeed philanthropic groups before that were offering any black person who wanted to leave the United States free passage from America to Freetown, and also was offering them free building materials to build a house, and would give them a plot of land when they got there so they could grow food and so on. This was all free. Well, free passage to Africa, free house, free land. Now that's a pretty good deal, and yet less than 1% of American slaves, that were formerly slaves before the Civil War, less than 1% of those slaves took up the offer. Now, this seems remarkable because the philanthropic groups were running around, as indeed with the government, running around making all sorts of proclamations, town centre proclamations, posters were being put up around the place. Now, a lot of blacks actually could read. This idea that all the blacks were literate is bullshit, because one of the key things that not all, but many blacks were taught was to read the Bible. So they were literate, or a decent number of them were. So these things are not mentioned or not highlighted. The idea that the British proclamations ending slavery were central to slavery being stamped out all over the world, or all over the advanced world anyway. The Africans were still doing it, but and the British actually were never fully successful in stopping the Africans from enslaving each other. The further you got away from the coast, the harder it came for the European powers or the white nations to police the slavery issue. But the internally in Africa, slaves were still the go-to for finding a labour force. That is blacks enslaving each other. So this is also not mentioned. So when you look at the key issues here, and so many issues that would add nuance and dimension to the history, they're all left out. That I just looking at, there wasn't not a single mention of anything that would give nuance. William Wilberforce and his tireless efforts to stop the slave trade and these sorts of things. The British actually did try to end slavery on one of their Caribbean islands, but the money the slaves wanted as payment was so great, and they refused to work unless they were given top dollar. And so in the end, the crop failed because the black workers refused to tend the crop, which then created substantial hardship and even starvation in some parts of the island, because the French and the Spanish, all the others were in the area. They stayed with the slavery, and they could, through better managed situations, they could undercut the price of I think it was sugar on that island, undercut the price of sugar. So there were a whole series of economic issues in and around slavery, because as soon as the blacks were given freedom on the island, they wanted, no, we want free housing, we want that to stay, we want the free food, we want that to stay, and we want to be paid a shitload of money. Whereas it was never sustainable given the prevailing price of sugar and the competition at the time. So that's not mentioned. So a whole lot of things aren't mentioned, or they're presented. I mean, one of the areas of famine and disease and so on is presented as a wicked, evil white people's plot, rather than a natural event of disease and the inability to produce enough crops and so on. The fields being untended and the like. So every direction you go in. Now I don't believe that it was impossible to get historians. I think you can read the basic facts and you can see for yourself. It's a fact that the creation of Freetown and it's a fact. The end of slavery, William Wilberforce, is a fact, and so on. So there's a whole range of hard, very clear facts that are simply not mentioned in these documentaries that have no other purpose than to make white history, particularly British history, given that they're the inventors of the modern, largely at least, the inventors of the modern era. So that it's a purposeful, willful, hysterical attempt to make all white history, particularly modern history, look bad. And so people are being paid to tell the most terrible lies. And the big media organisations like the BBC in Britain, and the list goes on, are taking these severely untruthful documentaries. They're not documentaries; they're just fucking propaganda, and showing them uncritically. They're not even adding little riders like hysterical anti-white people peddling anti-white hatred made this documentary, which is what they should be saying. So all this is going on. So when you look at documentaries, just take that critical eye to it and consider history in its wider context, but also in these cases the willful omission of key facts. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.